All righty, everybody, let us give a wonderful welcome. Gosh, I really wish that I could do like the Muppet Show or something introduction for Vincent here, but I do at least have his bio. We're doing Tree ID tonight with Vincent Verweij. And Vincent's an ISA certified arborist who is Arlington County's urban forest manager, which means that he oversees county streets, trees, and park trees and strives to maintain the tree canopy. Vincent also has past experience conducting tree assessments, tree mapping, and flood management. Vincent's been teaching and doing tree walks for the TreeStewards for several years, and his department supports our training in many valuable ways. As some of you have even heard little snippets if you were on for a bit. So now we will turn it all officially over to Vincent for Tree ID. Thanks, Vincent.
Thank you. All right, let me go share my screen and please confirm when you see it. Is that coming through?
Yes.
Got it.
Excellent. Thank you for having us or having me to present on tree identification. The way I often give people the option to ask questions is that because of my millennial skills, I can usually look at the chat on the side while I give my presentation. I'm gonna try to put a couple of breaks or maybe just one break in the middle for people to ask general questions and just unmute if it's something that requires a little bit more conversation. But if you want to put in questions during the presentation in the chat, it's a great way I can weave that into the conversation and try to answer it or let you know that it's coming in a future slide. So I learned tree identification really quite organically, both from just observation, but also classes and either classes in my undergraduate education at Ohio State. I don't care about football, so don't boo me. And at Virginia Tech, where I got my graduate education and Masters of Natural Resources. But then also just looking around, looking at trees, it almost becomes impossible once you get good at this, or even if you're not good at this, just to stop identifying trees. So please be careful while you're driving and keep your eyes on the road and don't get distracted by maple leaves or opposite arrangement too much, unless you stop somewhere. Okay, so how do you identify a tree? So this is kind of the order of which people usually identify trees using sight, touch, and smell and taste, usually in that order. Taste is usually last and rarely needed, but I have used it for certain types of black cherry can be very almondy tasting or smelling, so that can sometimes be a good identifying feature. Make sure to use all the parts of the tree. This is actually the skeleton of this presentation is a winter tree ID class, which if you can identify trees in the winter, you're going to be able to identify trees in the summer. Make sure to look at leaves, twigs, bark, flowers, fruit, thorns. Look at the shape of the tree. So what is it? Its overall look? How are its vibes? Look at the location in which it's growing, particularly if it's a naturally growing tree, that's probably something that belongs in that environment. And then look at debris around the tree, could be twigs or other things that it's dropped around. And make sure to practice. So other tools that could be helpful are a dichotomous key and field guides. I have, let me see if I can turn off my blur on this so I can show some videos. So let's turn off my blur. Okay. City of Trees is one of my favorite books, especially if you're in this region. This is written by Melanie Chukas Bradley. It's a field guide of the trees of Washington, D.C., and it's everything. It's not just native trees. It's native trees as well as a lot of our weird cultivars. Even goes into things like how we have a sequoia planted right next to the Capitol. And these trees that people have brought over either from diplomatic missions or because they were the director of the Smithsonian and wanted to bring something interesting in, or through USDA introduction, often they test things up. And yeah, I'll put the book name and author in the chat. The other obvious one is just the Audubon Tree Guide. There's nothing wrong with the National Audubon Field Guide to North American Trees. Comes with pictures of the tree leaves, which can be really useful, and very detailed descriptions as well. So you can go with either of those, honestly, but City of Trees is really specific to our region, so I really like that. Okay. I put the name in the chat of that first one. The second one is just the Audubon Guide. There's Audubon guides for every single area in this country. A hand lens, so small hand lens can be really helpful, particularly for trees where the identification is determined by the shape of the leaf scar. That can be really helpful. Developing a good memory, I know that's a big ask for most of us, but memory is encouraged by repetition and trying things again and again, as well as making weird associations sometimes. Sometimes you can find a little mnemonic to remember things, and I have one big one in this presentation. Sometimes you might need a sharp knife or clippers. Make sure that you have permission to cut something off of a tree before you do that. If somebody wants you to identify their tree, then you might just want to ask, hey, can I take some of this home, and I can help you ID this in the comfort of my home when it's not raining, or when it's raining. And then pattern recognition, attention to detail, and then memory again, because repetition legitimizes. And we'll go through pattern recognition quite a bit in some of the examples as well. So this is what a dichotomous key looks like, and to some of the tree stewards helping organize this. Did you all teach dichotomous keys already? Otherwise, I can do a quick run through.
No, we haven't
yet.
Okay, well, I'm happy to be the first introduction to this, unless you've already seen this. So a dichotomous key is really kind of like the choose your own adventure for figuring out what a tree is. So what the questions usually are, they're usually sequential. So you start at the first question, and you may have needle leaves or non-needle leaves. So if something has needle leaves, so remember, well, you might not know this yet, but pine leaves or pine needles are just needle-shaped leaves. So if that's the case, all right, go to 2. The needles may be in clusters, or the needles are singular or in singlets. And you may find that it's either a pine or a spruce. And then you can go farther and maybe take one of the books and go a little bit farther and figure out, is this an eastern white pine or a loblolly pine? This high-level dichotomous key can get you there. So let's do another one. So you could go to non-needle leaves. So go to 3. And we'll go through what these things mean. Simple leaves or compound leaves. You have a simple leaf here, a compound leaf here. And you go down the row and hopefully come to the right conclusion. And then you check that tree with in your field guides. It's like, okay, does it actually match what I'm looking at? Or did I go wrong along this dichotomous key sometime? So this is usually used for beginning tree ID people, and it can be really helpful. And or people who are trying to identify very challenging trees that really need a lot of confirmation to get to a proper. Okay, we're gonna go through some different leaf parts, and you don't necessarily need to remember all this, but it's helpful when you're looking at looking through field guides, because they're going to use terms similar to this. So when a leaf is composite, it can have leaflets. These are little, what looks like individual leaves. They're part of a larger leaf, and they have components of the leaflet or leaf are midribs, just the blade of the leaf, the rachis or rachis, which is between the leaf and the connecting part, and then the petiole, which is between the leaf and the twig. This will start to make sense as you look at this a little bit more, but wanted to just prime you all for this. Give me 1 second, let me close it. Then there are some ones that people might consider to be obvious, but you go with, you check the leaves for deciduous or evergreen. This might not always be obvious if we're not in the winter, but usually evergreen leaves and needles are much thicker. They're built to withstand the cold, and they're really set up for success to photosynthesize throughout the winter. Then how are they arranged on the stem, opposite or alternate? And I'll show you what that means in a little bit. We're going to talk about whether they're simple or compound, pinnate or palmate leaves, what the margins look like or the edges of the leaves, and what the base and the tip of the leaves look like, and then other special characteristics. So here are a couple of different types of leaves and how to look at them. So I talked about needles already, so those are fairly easy to identify, but then we have a different type of conifer that has a scale-like leaf. So these are kind of overlapping like armor platelets. Red cedars are a very common one, but there are plenty of other ones like Arborist, which might have a scale-like leaf as well. Now, in the broadleaf category, you have everything from simple leaves, which are leaves that do not have individual leaflets. So let's go back and forth between these. This leaf on the right, this is a whole leaf. And this is a whole leaf made out of 5 leaflets. Leaf on the left is one whole leaf, no leaflets, it's just one leaf. How do you distinguish the two? Is that the bud starts at the end of the leaf. So there's a bud at the bottom here, there's a bud at the bottom here, and there isn't one where these leaflets split up. So that's a really critical difference, and that's how you can identify whether something's a leaflet or a leaf and whether something has a composite leaf or not. So the simple leaves and composite leaves on the right, or compound leaves on the right. So with needles, we get often we get pine needles, which are in clusters, and then other conifers beside that, like spruce or fir, are usually individual or single needles. That's not this example, but they have scales like this with this example, which looks like a tree, or maybe a white cedar. We look at the leaf margins. We have, and this is where it gets a little bit more subjective on how you call these. And there's not necessarily as much consistency between these in field guides. So you have wavy, finely toothed, coarsely toothed, doubly toothed, and these descriptions can be really useful to memorize what you've been looking at in the field before you identify it, or to look at a field guide at the same time while identifying. So here's a good example. So I'm going to go back and forth between this. So this is probably one of the ones that you could call incurved teeth. Kind of single teeth, or you can call it coarsely toothed. Either of these would probably fit the description. Leaf shapes are also a good way to look at them. And while it could be useful to remember all these more technical terms, you can also ascribe things like that are a little bit more plain language. So like cordate, you could also just say heart leaf or heart shaped. Or oval round. You can really get a little bit more simple with some of these descriptions. But give it the description that makes sense for you, or learn these descriptions and go from there. Other things to look at are leaf tips, the tips of leaves, what's going on at the end of the leaf. So if you look at the previous one, that's just the top of these. One really important one to consider is whether the leaf has a bristle at the tip of the leaf. And that's going to be very important in oak identification. Some leaves are flat or truncate. Some leaves are obtuse or dull. Some leaves are acuminate or sharp, or acute, that's less sharp than acuminate. You can give like a spear point to this. This is more of a knife point. Also, looking at leaf bases can be useful. Is the bottom flat or does it slope? Is it uneven? That's a very useful one for things like lindens or hackberries, for example. So there's all kinds of parts that you can look at a leaf before you even look at the rest of the tree to try to identify. So here, I want to take a moment and if people feel comfortable going into the chat and giving me some suggestions on how would you describe this leaf? There isn't really a wrong answer. I don't need you to use the terms you just learned, but I want you to think about what this looks like and just put your answer in the chat. I'll give everybody maybe 30 seconds to put that in there. If you don't feel comfortable with the chat or you can't type it in, feel free to just unmute yourself and let me know. I love those answers because that's kind of what I was going for. So I'm getting some already. And I don't need everybody to answer, just need a couple. So lobed, I'm going to get started on some of these. Yeah, it definitely has lobes, some deeper lobes than others. It's truncate at the base and at the top. So it's kind of flattened at the base and the top. Looks like a cat's face. That's a common one. And also looks kind of like a tulip, coming out of two leaves. So this is a tulip tree. So this is one of the easier ones to start with. Those are some really good descriptions of how to look at this leaf. I probably wouldn't add any more to that. That's very good. The points are a little bit less sharp, maybe a little bit duller. Gilberto, this is a tulip tree, or what other people call tulip poplar, but I prefer calling it tulip tree. Let's do that one more time and look at a couple more times. Actually, I have another one after this. And look at this one. Can people put some ideas in the chat? Some good ones already. Okay. I'll try it all at the same time. Wavy and lobed are useful. Is this a simple leaf acute base? I don't think this is an acute base on this, but it is kind of acute at the top. Let's go back to that. So what does that mean? So is it sharp pointed or is it more rounded? So let's look at that. I don't really see a sharp pointed edge. Does it have leaflets? Well, that's hard to tell from here. So you can't actually see the bud, but there's one bud and the leaves are coming out of one bud. So that is actually kind of confusing on this one. So that would actually be helpful to look at again. I know that this tree, I just happen to know that this tree is not composite, does not have composite leaves. It's actually hard to tell from this picture. Yeah, so good, very rounded or wavy. Great, okay, so sorry, I went ahead. This is a white oak. This is, or one of the types of white oak. Rounded lobes, no points, no bristles at the end. You can't see them, at least on this picture. It is a simple leaf, not a composite leaf. All right, so let's try this one, see what we're thinking about this. And I want to think about the leaflets on this one. Which terms would you use to describe this? So what I'm seeing here, myself, yeah, toothed edges. That's one of the first things I'm looking at. Pointed, yeah, pointed, or acute, as somebody else said up on the previous one. And yeah, the leaflets are opposite. So this is one leaf. The leaflets are opposite. Very good. It's helpful. And I mean, it's also useful to just note how many there are. So there's 5 leaflets on this particular leaf. So this is probably a white ash, although that's hard to tell from just this picture. White ash has very narrow leaves like this. It's possible it's one of the hickories too, but we're just describing leaves at this point. All right, got 2 more examples. So let's give this a shot. See what you're looking at. Bristle tip, yeah, I do see a little bit of a bristle on this. Yeah, definitely lobed. This is a training, so just shoot it out there and let's discuss what their options are. Wide and flat, yeah, very wide leaf, very flat at the base. You know, one advantage of an in-person presentation is that I can shame people into answering, but I won't do that this time. All right. Yeah, those are some great answers. So we've got the lobes, we've got the flat edges, very wide. It's probably a sycamore leaf. It looks like it's a little thin too. All right, last one. This one, it's a very small leaf, and let's give some suggestions for this one. Toothed, yes. Jagged edge, perfect. Great descriptions. Good example of just using your own description of what it looks like. Kind of looks like it's waxy. Yeah, that's a good one. We hadn't even talked about the feel. So symmetrical versus staggered is opposite versus alternate, Pete. So you could see an alternate arrangement on this. That's a very good catch. Looks like it might be thick. Yeah, it might be a little bit thicker. This is a really hard one to identify from just the leaf, but those are some great identifier. It might be a hawthorn or a crabapple, but it could be a lot of different other things in the cherry family. But those are some great descriptions. All right, so let's go a little bit farther and go beyond the leaf. And we already kind of touched on this just now, on how leaves are arranged. So this is alternate versus opposite. This is how most of our trees in the region kind of break out, is where the leaf attaches to the twig. So this is the twig in the middle, and these leaves are coming out. There's a bud here. And this is an alternate arrangement. This is an opposite arrangement. This is going to take some time to get used to for some folks. It took me a little bit when I first learned this, but there's a mnemonic for this. And my favorite mnemonic is Mad Dawn Horse. People sometimes also call it Mad Cap Horse, but I'm not going to get into this. This is my favorite because of the trees that we have in this area. So the Mad Dawn Horse is a very mad horse, and it is the way to remember all opposite trees. So MAD stands for maple ash dogwood, Dawn stands for dawn redwood, and horse stands for horse chestnut. It's not the best mnemonic, but once you learn it, you're never going to forget it. So the horse chestnuts are also buckeyes. I broke that up. So also known as madcap horse. So these are oppositely arranged: maple, ash, dogwood, dawn redwood, and horse chestnut. I think there's maybe only one exception to it, and it's really easy to figure out. It's the alternate leaf dogwood, but the name tells you that it's unusual. Here's some examples. And Pete asked, is there a relationship between alternate opposite ridges and alternate opposite twigs? I think so, but I don't know if it's always the case. Yeah, I understand. So here's some examples of opposite arrangements. So you see this red maple, the buds are on opposite sides. These don't even have leaves on them, but this is where the leaf attaches. Here again on the opposite sides over here. This one's a little bit harder, but this dogwood, opposite side. And then this buckeye also opposite sides. This is probably an ash, this second. And the leaves are all over the place. So here's a red maple leaf. So it can be opposite and it can be composite leaves. So ash or compound leaves. Here's a horse chestnut. Here's a dogwood. So you start with this. Try to figure out whether a tree is opposite or alternate. You've already limited it to just these. There's no oaks, there's no lindens, no sycamores. A whole group of trees has already been shed for identification just by seeing this arrangement. Then it's useful to, if this is an open grown tree or a tree that's exhibiting pretty natural habits, it's useful to look at the tree form. And some trees, you probably know, like pine trees, can be very pyramidal or straight. Some of our oaks or elms can be very rounded. Some cultivars of trees are columnar. Sweet gums, ginkgos, things like that, be very straight and columnar and limited in width. Weeping is often a cultivar or a cultivation component, like the weeping willow. That can be a really easy identifier. And we get into a little bit more vague descriptions, like what does broad mean versus round. It's usually wider than it is tall. Oval, a little bit more compacted. Layered, this can be like Japanese maples, for example. And some trees like zelkovas and some elms can exhibit vase-shaped canopies, which can be very helpful for street trees, for example. And then I don't know why they put shrubby on this picture. If it's a shrub, it's not a tree, right? So here's some examples of where the tree is growing, a little bit more extreme examples to start out with. These are two of my pictures, one in Angkor Wat in Cambodia and one on Pictured Rocks in Michigan, which is a great place to visit when it's not too busy. It can be really useful to understand what environment something is growing in, because some of these extreme environments only have habitat for very extremophile plants. So these strangler figs or these really drought-resistant pines can survive in these extreme situations. So that limits your ID selection. The trees that need more water or are wetland species are probably not going to be on this situation on the right, for example, even though it's surrounded by Lake Superior. Other examples could be like very rocky environments, and then very close analogs to that can actually be just urban environments. These tough trees growing in street tree strips, constantly getting walked on, beat on by dogs, and having to deal with exhaust from the cars around them. So these are often fairly tough trees that we're trying to identify. Now we're getting into some really funky things. So bark characteristics. So this can be really subjective. So this is where we don't have a list like with leaf shapes, like the acute acuminate list. And this is where your description is going to be very useful. So that can be smooth, scaly, ridged, furrowed, fissured, platy, blocky, netted, all kinds of descriptions. So we're going to do another exercise here for a second. So I'm going to ask people again to describe this and tell me what you think how you would describe this. Smooth, scarred, straight. Yeah, the straight is a good description for the trunk. A little bit broken, yeah. Yeah, it certainly isn't as smooth as like a beech tree, which is unless somebody's carved into it. Probably. So this is a common characteristic of a red maple and some red maple trees. All right, let's do another one. Oh, gray. Sorry, thank you, Claire. John. let's look at this one. Cornflakes, very nice. Yeah, just use other analogies. Rough, definitely rough. Reach. Yep. Heard people use alligator bark for this, which alligators are also armored. So that's very similar. No, that's fine. I understood what you meant. So plated, yeah, that's a good description. I'm going to move to the next one. How about this one? How would you describe this? Oh, that's a good one. Sinewy or veiny. Yeah, doesn't have to be, they don't have to be pleasant words to describe them, like lace, latticed, furrowed. Excellent. Great descriptions. Yeah, and these are, this is where the field guides can lose themselves too. They often use all kinds of descriptions like this. All right, here's a little bit easier one. Oh, thank you, Rosie. I'm gonna actually back up for that. Rosie mentioned one that people often use is diamond pattern. So yeah, that diamond pattern or these diamonds inside of here can be a really good identifier. All right, this one's a little bit easier to describe, and you're going to get the name of this one too. Icky peeling. Yeah. There's bats that live underneath these, which is really cool. It's from this region. It's not native to Arlington, but it is from the region. Shedding, yeah, it often is. You can often see a pile. This one's easy with the name. It's a shagbark hickory. And there's very few of trees that are really this shaggy. Even sycamore doesn't get close. Here's another one that's be good to get some. Here, let me get some other ideas. So when you look at the bark, you can also look at things that are maybe not what you normally think of as bark, but are definitely characteristics of the tree. Deformed, wavy. And these big stabbers on the right. Scary, yeah, totally legitimate. Spiny, this is a good Halloween tree, right? Cracking, oh, that's a good one. I like that. It's one challenging term I've heard before is like cellulite or like some stretched skin sometimes, which is that's especially Halloween oriented. This is a honey locust, and people, I think there's evidence that these big spines were used for weaving and other tasks with textiles too. One really cool place to see this in action, these spines, is actually the equestrian center in Rock Creek Park, because this is a reaction to the horses rubbing the bark a lot. And you can actually see trees with just a massive, like gnarly burrow full of spikes. So it's a really cool way to see that. These were defense mechanisms against some of the now extinct large predators or large herbivores that we had on this continent. Think like the giant sloth and the mammoth as well. So this is a little bit anachronistic, except for against those horses that we brought over here. Sometimes bark doesn't behave, and that can be really frustrating, especially between young and old trees. So we've got a sweet gum on the left and a hackberry on the right. They're both kind of warty, and I could probably switch these pictures and maybe Photoshop off this leaf and have most tree ID experts be like, I'm gonna need some more information. But then when they get older, the hackberry really retains that warty texture, and the sweet gum largely gets rid of it except for on its twigs. So sometimes there's some behavior issues as well. And when I went back to, if I go back to this red maple, this is only one expression of red maple bark. But it's a good one to have in your mind as an expression of that species. So yeah, sweet gum hackberry. All right, then when we still haven't figured it out, we go to twig characteristics. And this is where we look at, sometimes we cut the twig off and look at the pith or the inside. We can look at bud scars where the leaf fell off or where it might have grown a leaf or is about to grow a leaf. Look at the bud shape, the lateral buds or the buds at the end of the twig. We'll definitely get a good look at that this weekend if you're joining for the Tree ID class. And the lenticels as well. Lenticels are these tiny dots that occur usually along twigs and in some species also on the bark are they easy to find. These are gas exchange nodules along the twig. They can be a good identifying feature. Sometimes you even have to look at the bud scar, or the leaf scar to identify a tree. Between green and white ash, that can be really useful. All right, we're back to exercises. If you thought you could just sit back and look at this presentation and let it all wash over, you're wrong. You're gonna have to give me some idea of how you would describe this bud. What do you see when you look at this? Furry, yes, some fuzzy, hairy. Yep. What's this shape like? Kind of a drumstick. I love that. Looks like a pussy willow. Yeah, up close it might. Ooh, like a flute glass, kind of conical. Yep. Some people also see a duck bill in this. Looks like a bug. Yeah, kind of looks like a bug for sure. Like a really shiny one. Probably soft. This is the tree with our largest native fruit, the pawpaw. And that can be, it has a very distinctive kind of golden brown bud with hairs on it. So that's usually a really good identifying feature in the literature. All right, I'm actually not going to ask for descriptions of this because I want to show you here how the critical component here of these buds is that they're clustered very close to each other. Yeah, it looks like a pine cone baby. I love that. It's like a tiny pine cone. It is not a pine tree. I'm actually going to tell you what this is because this is very indicative of this group of trees. This is usually an oak tree around here. They have these terminal buds that all cluster together. You see how it's at the end of the twig? The end of the twig is the terminal part of the twig. And this is where all these buds come together. These pine cone babies. And that's usually indicative of an oak species. And then you also get the clues from the acorns. Here's some more variety. And might take a little bit too much time to describe every single one of these with by group, but you can see just sometimes a bud size can really tell you something about what's going to happen with its leaf. This is a devil's walking stick, which has a double composite leaf in it. So this is a leaf that splits twice. So it's got petioles that come from the twig, then the rachises that come out of that petiole, and then the leaves come out of another set. So it has to pack a giant leaf inside of this bud. And that can be a really good identifying feature. So you've got some rounded buds, you've got some weird, like, I don't know, it's like, I don't even know what to describe that as. But what's interesting is that the bud scales on this are very prominent and kind of red. You've got tiny buds and you've got zigzagging twigs. There's all these identifying features you can use there. The lobster claw, perfect. Let's use that, especially one that has uneven lobster claw. Flower buds look different than leaf buds usually. With some trees, it's a lot harder to tell them apart, but sometimes it's so obvious. So obvious that even the bud describes the tree. This is a red bud's flower bud. It's a little bit pink, but maybe the person who described it didn't want to call it pink bud for some reason. And that one's just straightforward. That's very easy, especially in the early spring, to identify. What's also useful about red buds is their zigzag pattern over here. But I'll get into that more later when we look at individual tree species. But you can see a lot of variety in flower buds. So look at those and look at what they're describing. One that's very useful around here is our state tree, the flowering dogwood, which has this kind of hat shape. It's like a Russian Orthodox hat. That can be a really good memory. Mnemonic there. Noreen asked, are flower buds present in the middle of winter or did they form in spring? It depends on the tree to some extent, but you will usually see the beginning of flower buds. They start to really get large later on in the spring as they are about to bloom. Some trees bloom much later in the year, so you might not even see the enlarged flower buds until much later. But these are some examples of flower buds that usually are very evident in the spring. I'll give you an example when you want to identify a tree in winter. There's actually a whole winter tree ID section to this presentation, so you'll get some ideas. Sometimes you can actually see very early in the year some flowers already. This is our earliest flowering tree, the red maple, which starts flowering in like March, sometimes even earlier than that, and often gets ignored because it's usually still pretty cold. People aren't paying attention to trees yet. This can be a really good identifying feature. All right. Let's see how we're doing that. Okay, let's go through this practice section a little bit. And we're going to look at different characteristics of trees. And this is where just shout out what things you see as, or put in the chat, sorry, as things that just immediately pop out to you about this collection of images. What is the first thing that you're drawn to when you're trying to identify this tree? Some answers already. All right. Starting off strong there with columnar. Yeah, very straight, this tree. Definitely pine cones for sure. That's a big one here. And needles. So the needles that are in a cluster too. And if you remember from earlier in the presentation, clustered needles are usually pine trees. Now, what's useful here is we are also looking at how they're clustered. How many needles are in one bunch? And I see 2 needles in a bunch here. And usually 2 needles in a bunch on the whole twig. I see that these, when I'm looking at this tree, I might see that these cones are staying on even from a couple of years ago, but that might not be immediately evident. Another thing I look at is how rough the bark is. And then this tree is a little bit uneven, even though it's fairly straight up. It's fairly opportunistic and kind of like goes wherever the sunlight is. It probably has some competition. This is a Virginia pine, and we'll see some as well on Saturday probably, but one easy way to remember Virginia pine is the V in the needles. 2 needles that are short are usually Virginia pine. All right, let's do a different one. And you can probably already see this. This looks like a pine tree, but what differentiates this from the previous one? What do you, what really calls out as being different between the two? Yep, 5 needles per cluster. You're already looking at some of the very important parts of pine agate. Yep. Resembles parchment. It's a little rough. Yeah. Pointed cone. Yep, not as dull as the previous cone. The left top picture is a young cone, so this would be younger right before it turns into one of these. I never see these really before they get into the larger shape. I really need to take some time early next year to see these up close, because I don't think most people see a young pine cone. Very straight trunk, a little bit more even structure as well. So the 5 needles is a critical thing for this. This is one thing that's also kind of as a mnemonic. The 5 needles are also, there's also 5 letters in. So this is an Eastern white pine. There's 5 letters in white, so WHITE, 5 needles on the bunch. That's one of the parts of the identifying features. It's more straight, more evenly oriented than the previous one. Let me show you the difference. This one's a little bit rougher. This one's a little bit more organized. Very good. All right, we're going to go into a broadleaf tree here. So I want you to see, what are the critical things you're seeing from this? And of course, you're not going to see every one of these things at the same time, because it's not going to be flowering and fruiting at the same time. But these are, you might be able to identify a tree throughout the year by looking at it several times. Yep, opposite. Clustered seeds, very useful. Compound leaf. It is not palmately arranged, and I didn't get into this that much with the composite leaves, but this is a pinnately arranged leaf. So this pinnate is where the leaflets are along one center. And palmate is really where it's like a palm coming out of one point. Yep, vein-like bark or diamond, maybe broken up. All right. The opposite is very, very critical. It's a broader tree as well. So this is one of the ashes. So maple, ash, dogwood, dawn redwood, horse chestnut, mab, dawn horse. The A in mab is the ash, and that is the opposite arranged tree in here. So then you can usually get close with that. So, well, is it a maple? Well, no, it has a composite leaf like this. There are a couple of maples that have composite leaves, but not like this. They are not actually this even. The maples don't have large buds. Maples have very different flowers, and they have very different fruit, although they might also be keys, more like samaras. So that's how you distinguish the two. All right. This one, I'm just going to give the name away because that's not the exercise. I want to see what you're looking at over here. What are you seeing in these pictures? This one, lobed. Yeah. The acorns gave it away, the name, so I didn't feel like it was worth yeah, hiding the name, but I really want to see what we're looking at. What really pops out to you? Rounded margins, lenticels, yeah. See the little dots in here? You can remember them as lentils, but they are lenticels. Yep, nuts or seeds. Fairly straight trunk on this one. Clustered buds, 3 buds together at the end. Yeah, it can be multiple, more than 3 or less, but they're clustered at the end. So yeah, that's the oak family. And then with the lobed leaves, if there's no bristle at the end, it's usually a white oak, and I'll get into that at a later point as well. Yeah, the bark is kind of silvery, kind of plated. It's a little bit harder, but once you see a lot of white oaks, you might get a good eye for it. All right. What pops out over here? This one is a very striking one, very common in our environments, particularly our urban environments. What are we seeing here that really pops out? And I understand the flowers pop out, but I want to see what else does too. Yeah, we might only have bean pods at this time of year. We don't have the flowers anymore, seed pods. And good identifier, that is actually in the bean family. Yeah, the lenticels again, you can see them. Good catch. Fungus-like bark, that might be a trick, but that's a good point. So this actually is probably lichen that's growing on here, which has an association with fungi. Cordate, yeah, remembering those terms well. Heart-shaped or cordate leaf. That's an eastern redbud. And that is a very common tree around here, usually pretty short. So you can see the redbud component, the heart-shaped leaf. This one's pretty easy. Yeah, the cluster flowers are so cool. They actually exhibit something called cauliflory, which is where the flowers come straight out of a twig or trunk. All right. Keep going a little bit more with these exercises because they give a good, they may kind of force you to look at things in different ways. So let's see what we got here. What do we have in this situation? Dentate or sharp points, sharp edge, kind of a rounded shape on the tree itself. It's a little tricky on the bark, and that's intentional because the bark for this tree might be very almost too easy if you see it pretty. The pointed buds is very critical. I'm glad you pointed that out, pun intended. You could almost stab somebody with this. It's really sharp. Very long buds. This is an American beech. And the reason I said that this trunk is kind of deceptive is because this has a lot of lichen on it as well. And this is normally when it doesn't have lichen on it. Oh no. When it doesn't have lichen on it, it's a very smooth gray bark. Ooh, I love that. The flowers have tentacles. That's great. These the seeds in here are actually edible, but I could like getting the seeds before the squirrels. No, beech is not included in Mad Dawn Horse. These are alternately arranged buds and leaves. That's why it's not opposite, it's alternate. Yep. See, I said it's not consistent per se. So it's only the bud and the leaf arrangement that can be reliable. All right. I think this might be the last one. Check. Yes. Okay. Before we go for a break, so let's put our final effort into this before we break for a second, and then see what we got here. Very rough bark, yeah. 5 leaflets on this leaf. Alligator bark. And you have to use the term now that you have. Yeah. Once again, this is pinnate, not palmate. This one is tricky. Because if these 2 leaves were just a little bit higher, then it would be a palmate one. But this is a pinnately arranged leaf. Kind of an oblong shape, pointed leaflets, yeah. These buds are gigantic too. They're really big. There's only one at this terminal bud. There's other ones that are alternately arranged around here. And these seeds are very large as well, which is usually a pretty good cue. It's a pignut hickory. And how do I know it's a pignut hickory? Okay, so it has composite leaves. It's alternate. You can see the alternate arrangement here. It's got some of the best fall color. Of course, you can only see that for part of the year, so it's maybe not the best identifying feature. And it's got these nuts and then also this rough bark. So you've got at least 5 identifying features that can help you get it. All right. So I'm going to pause for a moment on Winter Tree ID. I'm going to pour myself some water. And let's see, could we come back maybe around 8 o'clock and we'll get started on this. All right. Let's get back into it. everybody was able to take a quick stretch break. Okay, we are going to go through winter tree identification because this is really where you can get some of your best tree ID skills that don't rely on leaves. So what's left after we have lost our leaves on most trees now? Of course, pines and other evergreens, even some broadleaf trees like southern magnolias are pretty easy to do in the winter because you still have leaves and needles to rely on. This is really for those that don't have leaves available for your identification. You might still be able to see the leaves on the ground, but that's unreliable to some extent because they may be degrading or they may actually be from a different tree nearby. So really want to know for sure that it fell off of a tree, or maybe it's still attached to a twig of that tree. But what's left is bark, buds, form of the tree, some fruit might be remaining, the branching type, and the habitat is, or where it's growing is still something you can do. So it's almost everything except for the leaves. So what I did in this presentation, I pulled out some of the most common trees in this region, non-native and native, and pulled out what you can identify in every single one of these genus or genera. So I'm only going to genus level, but I'm going to give some examples of the individual species as well. So this, if you identify all these bolded ones, so the non-bolded ones are less common. I don't have those in here, but if you can identify all the bolded ones, you can get extremely far with tree identification in this region. And then if you want to go farther, there's all these tree ID guides that can help you. And one thing I don't put on the tools in the beginning, which I maybe should start doing, is that iNaturalist now has had for a couple of years kind of an AI or machine learning application, and iNaturalist can identify, or at least try to identify, tree species or any species of any kind, any organism with pictures. So if you could take a picture of something, you might be able to get somewhere with iNaturalist as well. And even when the machine learning can't identify it, some of the plant nerds in this region are often happy to help out as well. All right, we're gonna go from A to Z on this. So we're gonna start with maples. So these are fairly varied, but they tend to have kind of flaking or cracked bark. They have clustered buds, although they're not clustered at the end. This is kind of tricky. They are clustered together and they're opposite. That's also a critical part of the opposite arrangement. Tend to be large canopy trees. When they're growing naturally, they're usually along streams. This is a funky identifying feature too, is that you can sometimes see sooty mold on some of the sugar maples and red maples. This is actually when a tree has been leaking some sap and the mold is eating them. And thanks, Noreen. Yeah, there's ID apps for your phone. There's all kinds of things like Seek iNaturalist, Picture This. Some of them cost money, some of them are free. And they can help with this kind of thing. If you used one of those apps, I would probably take a picture of the buds, and that can probably get you very far. With maple particularly, especially red maple, there's usually red buds on these, particularly in the middle of the winter. That can be a really great identifying feature. Tree of Heaven, not everybody's favorite tree, but this is one of our invasive plants. But they have a fairly smooth bark with slight bumps on them. Huge bud scars. This is probably to scale, depending on how big your screen is. They are like almost an inch high, holding a fairly big leaf. They tend to be an invaded habitat in our region, so less maintained or managed spaces will literally grow out of anything. If you know your literary history, the tree that grows in Brooklyn was an analogy of this tree with as somebody growing up in a tough neighborhood. And then the bark and twigs can smell like rancid peanut butter when you scratch them. So that's one of the ones where you go all the way to smell if you really have to. While this is not a great tree here, it is great in its native habitat. It is originally from Asia, and that's where it's from. So when you're in that habitat, I'd love to see this in its native habitat, see how it really shines as a part of a healthy ecosystem. There's only one species in this, so that makes this one a bit easier to distinguish. Serviceberry, this is a smaller tree, and this is really where the term stretch marks comes in very helpful, because I see it on almost every serviceberry. It can be really helpful for identifying this tree. Sometimes has a lichen on it, actually quite frequently. It's a fairly, it attracts quite a bit of lichen to the tree, particularly on this image. Can have remnant fruit and sometimes have something called seed or apple rust, which infects the fruit and causes people or animals not to want to eat it. And that means it sometimes stays around in the winter. It's a fairly small tree with the stretch marks and the smallness. You can usually figure out that it's a serviceberry, and you'll need your field guide to figure out between arborea and Alankia arborea, canadensis, or laevis. Birch. This one is a little bit easier, especially in winter. We have two major ones. We have Betula nigra, which is our river birch, and Papyrifera, which is our paper birch. There's also a handful of paper bark there's a handful of white birch, European white birch, but they're fairly uncommon, so I didn't include them here. They tend to have a white or light bark. The river birch has a paper-like, or has a peeling white bark, and then the paper birch has more of a smooth white bark. Tend to have very thin canopy, very small twigs, medium size. The largest one we had wasn't nearly as large as some of our large oaks. Often along streams and in landscapes. So you can see this over here. It's kind of a formal landscape. This one's pretty easy. Oh, good question, Glenda. Is the multi-trunk on this natural? No, it's actually forced. While we do, if you're buying it in the nursery, it's usually multiple trees kind of crammed together. You do sometimes see multiple trunk trees in the wild, but they tend to be just two trunks, and that is obviously just one tree. But this is really like an aesthetic form that's been forced by the nursery industry. I actually recommend you get single trunk purchase because of that, because it can actually have some structural issues at the base of the tree. But people really like this look of this multi-trunk tree. I don't particularly love it for structural reasons. All right, we're going to move to hornbeam. This one's fun because this is a really good one to identify by bark. Hornbeam, our native hornbeam, is also known as musclewood, and that's actually my favorite common name because it looks like a sinewy, muscly tree. That's like a really kind of like this tree's been working out a lot. It tends to be a fairly small tree. The native one is a little bit more gnarly and witchy looking. The non-native one has been bred so much, this Carpinus betulus, that it's very straight and often used as a hedge tree. If you've ever been in many parts of Germany, but particularly in Southwest Germany, they use this all over the place, along with beeches for shaving into hedges. So this is really where the bark is just so typical for this species. You often don't have to go beyond that. Hickory is a little bit more variable. You saw a couple of examples. It can go from smooth with tight lines and ridges to the pecans and shagbarks, which are a lot rougher and all over the place. Particularly shagbark, but you're probably not going to need much help with that one. The buds are usually used for ID in the winter. They tend to have very different shapes to them. And that's usually where you have to get your field guide out and figure out the fuzzy bud, how big is it, how's it arranged. This is another alternate tree. It tends to have a very light, they tend to be very large trees with a very wide range. Not usually planted in our landscapes. We're trying to find more sources for these, but these tend to be more naturally grown trees. We've got a ton of species here. We've got bitternut, mockernut, and pecan. The shagbark hickory is often planted, even though it's not from around here. And I always forget the other one. Bitternut, mockernut, pignut. The pignut is fun because it's the inside of its fruit looks like a pig's snout, which I had an example of earlier in this presentation. Hackberry, I kind of brought this one up earlier as well. The warty bark is a really good identifier for this. They often have small remnant fruit. They're not as large as you see them here. They're about, I don't know, like a 1/4 inch to 1/3 of an inch large fruit. Because the stone or the seed inside of it is so big, most birds are like, that's not worth my while, and they often leave some of it onto the tree. The tree is very uneven. It's very opportunistic, kind of just grows wherever the sun is, doesn't really have much of a plan, and then just keeps going. So it doesn't necessarily have a lot of structure unless you force it into the structure. Redbud, we saw that flaking bark earlier already. We saw the pods on it, the bean pods. It tends to be kind of a smaller tree with an uneven, also kind of witchy form. And then the zigzag branches are kind of evident in this bottom picture where the branches go back and forth, the twigs go back and forth. And that can be a good ID feature if you don't have the beans. This one's pretty easy. This tends to be a kind of a darker, flaking bark as well. Mostly just Cercis canadensis, which is the eastern redbud, which a couple people have planted Oklahoma redbud or Chinese redbud, but they're not common. Dogwood, this one's also kind of all over the place because you can see 2 different dogwoods here. You have very blocky one for our native flowering dogwood, or Conus florida. And then we have this like camo one on the right, which is this is a very extreme version of it that I've seen them like this. This is the Coosa dogwood. Almost looks like a sycamore bark, but they are opposite, except for the alternate leaf dogwood. So to distinguish between this and a sycamore, this one is opposite and the sycamore is alternate. The buds can be very distinctive, like these little hats again. And it's usually a small tree and very common in our landscapes. So if you're looking at a formal landscape, you'll find this tree a lot. Persimmons, very dark, blocky bark, almost black. It's in the ebony family, and you can kind of understand, how that can be a good connection here because of the darkness, the dark black bark. There's almost nothing that's that dark in our ecosystem around here. We have the native Virginiana, Diospyros virginiana, and we have the non-native kaki, or the just like grocery store persimmons. These are much larger fruit. They tend to have they're actually growing their fruit right now, and they have them sticking around. The native isn't planted very often, but the non-native one we have all over the county, and people produce a lot of fruit. And they tend not to be a very large tree, so that's a good way to distinguish between these two. Okay, we looked at beech earlier. We have mostly the Native American beech, grandifolia, Fagus grandifolia, and then some European beech, or Fagus sylvatica. Very smooth bark, sometimes vandalized, like people carve into it. It can be a very big tree. Some of the largest trees in our canopy are beeches. Excuse me. And you may see fruit husks laying around and those pointy buds, really pointy buds. And like I say, this one's easy to get to beach, but it might be really hard to tell between the American and the European. But one major way I would probably say is that the American beech tends to be more in our natural forests, and the European one is more likely to show up in a landscape space. All right, ash, an opposite tree. We looked at this earlier as well. It's got the diamond bark. The branches have horns almost on them. They look like they're given the devil horns. Typically a fairly large tree, and used to be a common street tree in the north, but now declining, and we don't have a whole lot of street trees of this species anymore. Because of emerald ash borer, that's what EAB stands for. So opposite, but why is it not like a dogwood? Well, it's got very thick buds. The bark is very different from the dogwood, not that blocky or the camo look. Then you've got these horns as well. Oak Glenda EAB is emerald ash borer. That's what's killing a lot of ash trees around here and the whole country. Ginkgo, this is a very fun tree because this is one of those trees people call a living fossil. This is something that predated some of pretty much every tree that we are familiar with. And even some of the tree ferns and living before the dinosaurs existed. And this is a remnant from that age. Tends to have very smooth ridges on its bark. Makes sharp corners with its twigs, very kind of aggressive. It tends to conservatively branch, so it's like very slow growing, and only where it knows it's going to have access to the sun. And these stacking buds are they stack on top of each other. Every year you'll see a new stack on top of each other because it doesn't grow another twig in these places very often. It's just reusing this bud location. And this is one of the easiest ways to identify it. Kind of even a younger ginkgo, but usually a middle-aged ginkgo can really easily identify this. We just have ginkgo biloba. That's the only species left in the world. Honey locust we looked at a little bit earlier, so I'm not going to get through that too much. You may still have these beans left over, kind of a flaky bark, and an uneven form, kind of a witchy tree as well. Walnuts are also fairly easy, especially if they still have their fruit on it. They are starting to lose their leaves now. They are almost done with the year. Very early at losing their leaves. The walnuts are usually on the ground unless people clean them up, and they can usually cause everything, almost everything around it to die because they have a chemical in the nuts called juglone, which can often act as a very strong herbicide for everything but the walnut itself. Very dark bark with deep ridges. There's a lot of things you could use for ID frames. Sweet gum we looked at earlier as well, but what we didn't look at is these ridges on the twigs. That can be a really good identifier for this sweet gum. It has giant buds, ridges on the twigs, and a kind of blocky, warty bark. And I have kind of a bad joke in here. Sometimes if they're planted along the streets, they can just really destroy a sidewalk pretty hard. So that can be an identifying feature from its surroundings. Tulip tree. We saw a leaf of this earlier, but we didn't see some of the buds. And this is one of the easier ones too. It tends to be a very tall tree, usually the tallest tree in our forest when they're old. They have these kind of duck-billed buds, which are really neat. They usually have remnant seed heads, and even far into the winter, that can be a very easy way to identify the tree. It's a magnolia. These seed heads, you can see really that it has that magnolia shape in it. The bark can be a good identifier too, but usually you can tell the first thing you should look for is these seed heads. And that's usually a pretty easy tell. You can see the duckbills in here as well. And then eventually you'll get to recognize the bark as well. Oh, I'm not sure why this is green. I hope it's still legible for folks, but this is different types of magnolia. Usually have a smooth bark with lenticels, often gray most of the time, except for our southern magnolia, which is not described here. That's an evergreen. They tend to have very fuzzy buds, like you want to pet them kind of fuzzy buds. And often common landscape plant. We have particularly star magnolia, stellata, virginiana, which is our sweet bay magnolia, and solangiana, which is our saucer magnolia. Usually a small to medium tree, not very large unless it's a southern magnolia, but then you don't need winter tree ID for these. Fuzzy buds are really what I usually take with this. Meta sequoia, this is dawn redwood. And this is one of the mad dawn horse trees. This is an extremely straight up tree, very straight. They are oppositely arranged, but so they're not mentioned in mad cap horse, and that's why I suggested we change it to mad dawn horse. They often have remnants of little fruit, little cones left, and they can have kind of a flaky, multicolored bark. Very extreme, very even form, almost looks like a flame. That's really how you can identify it. And the fact that it's a deciduous conifer, it's lost its leaves, really just leaves you with this metasequoia or dawn redwood, bald cypress, and larch. And larch is extremely rare around here. All right, we're in the M's. We have mulberry. This is also one of those invasive trees. If it's a white mulberry or Morus alba, our native mulberries of Morus rubra, red mulberry, often has orange in the bark. That's a good identifier for medium-aged trees. But when they're older, they get this really rough, uneven bark in here. Often very messy-looking trees. Kind of medium to large size. If you have a moment, look up the mulberry craze of the 1800s. It's a really fun kind of moment in the 1800s where everybody wanted to plant white mulberries to support the nascent silk industry, which ended up just being nascent and never taking off in the US. Tupelo, this is one of my favorite trees. Extremely blocky bark. Used to be related, more related genetically to Cornus florida or flowering dogwood. Then they found it's actually a little bit more distant. It's still related, but not as related as we used to think. They tend to live along streams. They are very large, long-lived trees. This is one of the oldest broadleaf trees of the eastern seaboard. Can live up to 600 years or older. And they form very evenly when open grown and very unevenly when they're wild. You can see a picture of the form from a distance here. And one thing I wrote down here that says, someone sat on it. You see this, it looks like a giant sat on the top and squished it. And once you see this a couple of times, you're going to understand why this is one of the best ways to identify this tree. We started planting this a lot as street trees as well. Right. The deep O's, hawthorn beam. This is a little bit less common, but I still kept it in here because it's a common forest tree. Very easy to identify by its strippy bark. This is very thin strips all over the tree that come off fairly easily. It's a small tree, so not like the shagbark hickory, which is much larger. And it's usually in the understory. It's exfoliating regularly, taking care of its skincare routine. Sycamores, if you don't identify this, and maybe go back to the beginning. No, I'm just kidding. This usually has a camo-looking bark. or a white bark when it's lost some of that camouflage. The fruits are either one fruit or multiple fruits on from one flower, and that's a good way to identify between the Native American sycamore and the plane tree. Plane tree tends to have multiple fruit, and American sycamore tends to have just one fruit ball per segment. In their native habitat, they're usually along streams. You'll see them along 4 Mile Run a lot, and the London plane tree has been really bred to be a street tree and just live really well in that urban environment. So you can see them along both. Cherry, this is where the lenticels really come in, and we can see some of the expression in the younger bark or even older bark. You see this very obvious lenticels. When you get really, really old black cherry, you start losing it obviously, but you can still see it on the flakes. Still see the little holes. One thing that people say about black cherry, which is Prunus ceratina, is that it looks like burnt potato chips, which I find to be pretty useful. It has to be gray to black. There are some birches like black birch that might look very similar, but most of the time around here, this is something that looks like this is going to be a cherry or a very close relative like a plum. So we've got the black cherry, we've got some of the ornamental cherries. This is usually a weeping variety, and the Yoshino cherry, which is the famous one, and then the Okame cherry, which is a pink early flower. Maureen asked, do the lenticels still function at the potato chip bark stage? I believe so, but I'm not the expert on that. I'm not entirely sure, so let me look that up for you later. I'm not going to do that right now. Pears. This is also a very divisive tree. One of the trees that we see in our streetscape still is the calorie pear, which is the species of the Bradford pear, which was planted all over in the 1980s as this perfect, quote unquote, street tree, because it had beautiful fall color and flowers, and it would grow in almost any situation. Except then 10 to 15 years later, it started falling apart all over the place and became one of our invasive trees. So we do not plant this anymore, but you will still see it. They have a dark bark. They branch very low. They tend to have this remnant fruit in the winter because nothing is eating this non-native tree. And they sometimes have a little spine at the base of the fruit, but that's not always clear. Now, there are also other ones like common pear and the Asian pear. But those are usually in gardens and places that are cultivated like that. So I put them in here, but the most common one is going to be this Caloriana or calorie pear, or specifically the cultivar Bradford pear. See the spines on here too, good identifier. All right, going through some of the oaks, we're already at Q. So I actually broke this group up into two because we have a lot of species in the oaks. The white oaks tend to have this gray silvery bark, sometimes in strips or deep ridges. Often you can still find their acorns around and tend to be larger than the most red oaks, except for northern red oak. They have the clustered buds, and they're more common in natural areas and larger yards than some of our red oaks, which are more common in our streetscapes. So you can usually get to this by the bark color and any kind of acorns that are. But this is one where if you need species level, the leaf might be necessary. Red oaks are much darker usually, so that's a darker bark than the white oak, but you can still see some silver on it, right? And still have the clustered buds, smaller acorns, except for the northern red. Sometimes they have stripes. You can kind of see like little pinstripes on the acorns that can help you identify it as a red oak. They tend to be more common as street trees. got cochineal, which is scarlet, southern red, pin oak, willow oak, which is one of our common street trees, most common street trees, northern red oak, and then black oak. So yeah, you really probably can only get to genus level unless you start getting a really good eye for the bark and the form of trees to get to this species. Noreen asked, do you think Arlington will ever offer a pear tree boundary? So I heard about this in, I think, Georgia. They were offering payment for pear trees, and the Virginia Department of Forestry now also offers this quote unquote bounty. So if you want to look on the Virginia Department of Forestry website, I think they have a sort of grant or payment for getting rid of pear trees. So I think that might be the best way to look for it. If you can't find it, just email me and I can find it for you. Okay, we're at the R's. Sumac. This one is one that's almost not a tree, almost not big enough to count, but I still put it in here because you see it a lot. And some of them get to tree size. They have a very similar smooth, bumpy bark to Alanthus or the tree of heaven, but they're so fuzzy on the stems. It's almost as fuzzy as magnolias, but it's the stems that are fuzzy. They tend to be a little bit smaller, and they tend to hold on to these berries fairly late into the year. These berry spikes. We've got a smooth and staghorn, along with a couple of other species, but those are the most common ones. Black locust is not too dissimilar from honey locust, except the spikes are much smaller and the ridges are much deeper. They can be a fairly aggressive native species that can compete with tree of heaven and other species in these invaded, unmaintained, or unmanaged habitats. We also have these beans, which makes them often tells you that they're in the bean family, and that can be a really good start for identifying trees. All right, we're at the S. Willow trees. The weeping willow is fairly obvious. That's one of these. This is a very dramatic picture. They tend to be either, when they're not weeping, they tend to be kind of multi-trunked in their natural environment, not necessarily one major trunk. And they tend to live in stream sites, so along the 4 Mile Run and other streams in this region, or Cameron Run if you're Alexandria. Then going to T, bald cypress. They can be identified also very similar to meadow sequoia or dawn redwood. So I'm going to flip back real quick. So a fairly straight deciduous conifer. The meadow sequoia or dawn redwood is opposite. And bald cypress or taxodium is alternately branched. The cones are more like little balls than the separated out one, meadow sequoia. But you really have just 2 species to pick between. If you see a deciduous conifer, it's bald cypress or dawn redwood. Check if it's alternate or opposite, and you're usually going to be able to figure it out. We have bald cypress and then something called pond cypress, and the botanists are still battling each other to figure out whether that's 1 species or 2 species. But they can tell me when they're done. All right, linden. This is the bark on linden is fairly similar to fraxinus or ash, but they have alternate branching. You can see the alternate buds here. And these buds are so round, almost like they almost look like little snails. Very chunky, like round buds. And that can be a really good identifier for linden. They're so round, they're easy to tell apart from other trees. The roundness also kind of forms in the shape of the tree, usually very round shaped tree if they're open grown. And some of the trees, almost all these species are common street trees. We plant a lot of American lindens these days. We've got American linden, little leaf linden, and silver linden. You can see that cordata, that's actually speaking to the leaf shape, heart-shaped leaves as well. But this is winter tree ID. We're not talking about it. All right, and the last one is elm. we have several species, native and non-native. American elm, Chinese elm, the Siberian elm, and the red or slippery elm. Very strippy bark and very obvious in the parvifolia, the Chinese elm. This is another camouflaged one, but it's alternate, usually a much larger tree than the Coosa dogwood, or not as large of a tree as the sycamore. Tends to be much messier than the other ones that are camo barked as well, kind of uneven habit. And for the Siberian elm, we often see something called bacterial wetwood, where they have wounds that ooze and cause this discoloration in the bark. All of these you can see, except for maybe Siberian elm as a street tree. Red or slippery elm is not that common either, but it has been seen, and American and Chinese elm are extremely common street trees. Now, I was talking about the linden being round, but this is another very round bud. It's almost like a little turtle shell on top of the twig. But this one has a lot more bud scales to them, and it's not as smooth as the linden. Clay, you asked, is Zelkova same as Chinese elm? No, it is not. Zelkova is actually in a different genus. It's Zelkova serrata usually. And they also have a little bit of a camouflaged bark, but they have a composite leaf, not a simple leaf. So that's how you tell those apart. All right. I made it to 8:37. I am happy to answer questions. If you want to unmute yourself, I'll leave this up for a little bit in case you want to copy this over. But your contacts at TreeStewards always have my contact if you don't. I'm best reached by email. You can call me. It'll probably go to voicemail. I will probably try to email you back if I know your email address. But if you need to discuss something, feel free to give me a call. I can put you in contact with the right person or answer your questions. Yeah, open up to any questions from that. I'm happy to go back to different parts of the presentation as well. I know there's nothing going on tonight that people could possibly want to watch, so.
I have a question, actually.
Sure.
My name is Kristen. A friend of mine was curious why Arlington is offering bald cypress trees, given that if you look at a zone map, it doesn't look like it's really from this area. So that's one of the free trees they're giving out. Would you happen to know why?
Yeah, sure. I was part of that conversation. Through our tree distribution, our tree canopy fund, we select trees that are regionally native. So bald cypress is native to like 50 miles from here. It's not really that far away. So you can actually find bald cypress all the way up to the Jersey coast and just south of here, just not exactly in Arlington County, but it's a very urban hardy tree. It's still native to this continent. And it's one of those trees that I would not plant in a natural restoration planting, but it's almost native and it does really well in our environment.
Thank you.
Okay. Anybody else thoughts?
Hey, Vincent, could you talk a little bit about the, what is it, the mini forest concept?
Oh, yeah. Thanks for calling it that too. So there's a concept that's been developed over decades by a Japanese researcher with the last name Miyawaki. And he's been working to create a fairly dense planting style called the Miyawaki method. And we've adapted this method into our own application for tree planting, where we plant trees very close to each other. And the purpose for that is the trees can start collaborating quickly with root grafting. They usually require less watering. They often outcompete invasive species in these spaces. You can actually see some examples of this type of planting in Bluemont Park. And we're still experimenting with this a little bit to see if we can get natural or regeneration from these types of planting methods to expand our natural areas. There's an article, I think, in the New York Times. I know not everybody's going to have access to that. Let me see if I can find it, because it shows it visually very well. And it's usually extremely densely planted tree planting. So I'm going to share my screen. You can see. So very densely planted, often like 2 to 3 feet on center. This is kind of a joke version of it, but you kind of get the same idea. You can often get a really dense, very high on ecosystem services forest. It's not appropriate for every place. So like if you need to be able to look through this forest for security reasons, it's not necessarily the right thing for that. Where it tends to be a fairly self-sufficient way of restoring this space. All right.
Is that with different kinds of trees, or it looked like some of them were the same tree, just many of them?
Yeah, we usually pick at least 5 species of trees. Sometimes in some of these tropical Miyawaki forests, they're picking like 10, 12, 20 species of trees because their diversity is so much higher. All right. Well, thank you, everyone. I believe this presentation will be posted, so you can use this as kind of like a mini field guide as well for Winter Tree ID. And otherwise, feel free to send me a message, talk to your other tree stewards. Tree ID together can be a lot of fun. And we're getting into that season where you might feel like you're cooped up inside. Maybe find some time to go outside and do some tough winter tree ID. When it's nicer, of course, not like a day like today. And really get into it, because it requires some repetition, like I said. And it's worth it. You'll get to the point where you're just walking in the forest and going like oak tree, maple tree, beech tree, and you're going to impress all your friends.
Thanks,
All right.
Vince.
Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you
Thank
so
you.
much. Good
Great
night.
news, everybody.